Today we're headed up Jerimoth Hill, the rooftop of the ocean state. Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're in Rhode Island and heading up Jerimoth Hill. But before we start this adventure, take a moment, click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Jerimoth Hill is found in the northwest part of the state near the town of Foster in Providence County. It's considered part of the New England uplands, in particular the Mohegan Range, a series of northeast ridges that dominate eastern Connecticut and western Rhode Island. Rhode Island can basically be divided up into two physiographic regions. The first is the aforementioned New England uplands, also known as the Western Rocky Uplands, and they're characterized by higher elevation and rolling hills. The other is the coastal lowlands, and down there you'll find lower slopes surrounded by beaches and lagoons. The land making up Rhode Island wasn't always part of North America. It was formed when the microcontinent of Avalonia smashed into the larger continent. This makes Rhode Island unique amongst its New England counterparts, being the only state entirely formed from the basement rock, the thick foundational rock, of this smaller landmass. It's this erosion-resistant rock that gives Jerimoth Hill its height, as other less resistant rock was eroded and weathered away. Further land formation would come from the erosion of the Appalachian Mountains, though massive sheets of ice would extensively rework this over the ages. More than a few of Rhode Island's geological features are the result of glaciation. This state has been repeatedly covered by these ice giants, dating at least as far back as 2.5 million years ago at the end of the Pleistocene. More recently, Rhode Island was covered by ice 3 times in the last 100,000 years, the latest being the Wisconsin Glacier at the end of the last ice age. This state wouldn't be free of glaciers until about 16,000 years ago. The glaciers did leave their mark, though, in the form of the most recognizable feature of Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay. It was formed from an ancient and massive glacial lake. Covering 147 miles, it dominates the southeastern part of the state and is the largest estuary in New England. Human habitation in Rhode Island began about 10,000 BC, first with nomadic tribes coming through and hunting this area. Paleo-Americans would settle here and start cultivating the land around 7,000 BC. By the time the Europeans arrived, the dominant tribes here were the Narragansett and the Wampanoag. In the beginning, relationships between the Native Americans and the European settlers in Rhode Island were fairly peaceful. The friendly relationship between the Narragansett and the first European settlers proving critical to the early colony's survival. All that changed with the outbreak of King Philip's War in 1675. The war would prove catastrophic for both the Narragansett people and colonists alike. Providence would be burned in 1676, and by the war's conclusion, the Narragansett were basically no more, the remaining tribe members absorbed into neighboring tribes. When it comes to the Rhode Island that we know today, there's a couple of questions that we need to ask ourselves. First, how did this smallest of states come to be? Second, why is it named Rhode Island when it is clearly much more than that? And then third, why is the Highpoint located where it is? Well, to
The answers to all these questions actually relate to the actions of one man. So that's where we'll start.
With the first question, how did Rhode Island come to be? Why wasn't it gobbled up by either Connecticut to the west, or particularly Massachusetts to the north? It's a rather fascinating story that has had a lasting effect on our national ideals, and despite Rhode Island's small size, the central tenet related to its founding continues to loom large in our national conversation.
For starters, Rhode Island was never going to be big. It has been small from the get-go. You could say that this place is the result of call it a social experiment in governance and religion, brought about mainly by one individual, Roger Williams, a Puritan minister whose views on the divine and the world around him continues to have a lasting effect even to this day.
The great irony of Roger Williams is not that he didn't believe. Quite the opposite, really. No one, even his enemies, could criticize him on his faith. He was zealous, one of those rarest of things, a true believer. It was his deep faith that led him to realize a truly divine God would never involve itself in mundane human affairs, and that Christians violated the word of God when they mandated religious acts.
Once Williams arrived at that conclusion, well, he began to have serious concerns about the corruption of religion, particularly when involved in civil and government actions. In his mind, the two were just not compatible. Fortunately for Williams, he was a charismatic man and had no problem gaining followers. Unfortunately for Williams and his new congregants, those beliefs were soon in conflict with those of the ruling authorities.
The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded on Puritan principles, with religion very much in line with government. Williams' preaching about separation of the two was a direct challenge to the order and the very foundation of their colony. The two parties repeatedly came into conflict, and eventually Williams was tried, convicted, and banished from the colony for no less than 300 years.
Roger Williams' flight from Massachusetts Bay Colony has become stuff of American folklore. His trek in the dead of winter, one of the foundational elements of religious freedom in America. Williams would end up on the left side of the Providence River, on the north end of the Narragansett Bay. There, he would purchase land from the Narragansett peoples and founded the Providence Plantations, what is now Providence, the capital of Rhode Island.
Shortly afterward, another group of exiles arrived, this time led by Anne Hutchinson, another Puritan malcontent banished from Massachusetts for her views. Williams was able to get her and her followers situated on Aquidneck Island. And it's here where we need to put the answer to the first question on pause and take a look at our second question. Why is it named Rhode Island when it is clearly more than that?
The answer to this question has to do with the island that Roger Williams purchased for Anne Hutchinson and her followers. Originally, Rhode Island was exactly that, an island. Aquidneck Island, to be exact. Roger Williams would be the one that gave it the name Rhode Island, named after the Isle of Rhodes in the Mediterranean. But why that name? Well, to dig a little deeper, we need to rewind history just a bit further.
The first reference to Rhode Island dates back a century before Roger Williams arrived on the scene. In the 1500s, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed through this area and spent several weeks exploring the islands. He wrote about how an island in the bay reminded him of the Isle of Rhodes in the Mediterranean Sea. Verrazano's writings were published and well read across the continent, influencing future explorers and settlers, to include the English. A second reference comes from the early 1600s, when Dutch navigator Adrian Block explored the area. He spied an island there, and because of its reddish rocks, named it Rhode Island, Dutch for Red Island. Regardless, by 1644, Providence Court ordered the island be officially known as Rhode Island. From then on, until 2020, the colony and later the state would be known as Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations. With the second question answered, let's get back to the first.
While its colonial neighbors of Massachusetts and Connecticut may have thought little of this bastion of ne'er-do-wells, a Massachusetts court going so far as to call Rhode Island the sink of New England, neither of them would have had any issue about gobbling up these settlements if they would turn prosperous. This is something that Roger Williams was very much aware of and keen to avoid.
To confront this challenge, Williams decided to play to his strengths, his faith, charisma, and intelligence. He sailed for England and convinced no less than Oliver Cromwell himself this social experiment on the separation of government and religion was worth doing. This, of course, was completely opposite to Cromwell's views, but fortunately for Roger Williams, his timing was impeccable. Cromwell needed all the support he could get in the early days of the English Civil War, and he couldn't take any chances in causing rifts among his Puritan forces. Parliament would issue a patent for Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations in 1644, ensuring the small colony's autonomy.
All was well and good until Cromwell died and the Stuart monarchy was restored. Now there was a very real possibility that Rhode Island could be snuffed out. After all, it had been officially sanctioned under parliamentarian rule. Williams, being no fool, opted to take no chances.
Fortunately for Williams and the colony, they had an agent already in London named John Clark, who was able to capitalize on the moment. New to the throne and not inclined to upset the delicate balance that put him there, Charles II reconfirmed Rhode Island's patent and both codified its principles of religious freedom and provided a great deal of self-autonomy. The Royal Charter was signed in 1663 and would serve as a guiding document for the colony and later the state for the next 180 years.
But that's not all Connecticut's new Royal Charter did. And it's here we get the answer to our third question. Why Rhode Island's High Point is where it is. Because with the swipe of a pen, and much to the dismay of neighboring Connecticut, the king actually extended small little Rhode Island's boundaries to the west, ensuring that other outcast communities that had cropped up over the years would be folded in Rhode Island's purview.
It's this action that gave Rhode Island its high point at Jerimoth Hill, because according to Connecticut's charter, signed a year earlier, that colony had claim to all land west of the Narragansett Bay. Now, though, Charles' decree moved Connecticut's eastern border 20 miles west to the Pawcatuck River. While Rhode Island had most of its current shape and its high point, its borders wouldn't finally be settled until 1862.
Here in Rhode Island, the affairs of the divine and the affairs of man would not be mixed. And that led to an amazing degree of religious tolerance, particularly when you consider the religious wars plaguing Europe in the 17th century. Rhode Island was the only colony purposely established with the ideal of religious freedom. I've actually got a personal connection to colonial Rhode Island. One of my distant ancestors on my mom's side, Caleb Carr, was the colonial governor here in 1695.
Rhode Island's small size makes it ideal to add in additional sites during your highpointing adventure. Here's a few that I find interesting that you may wish to check out when you go to the state highpoint.
If you really have no shortage of time, then you may consider some island hopping. Rhode Island has numerous islands both in the bay and along its coast, each with their own high points and unique stories to tell. You could have quite an adventure exploring them all.
But if you're just looking for the big-ticket items, then consider Beacon Hill on Block Island, the most isolated peak in the state, or Beacon Pole Hill in the northeast corner, the state's most prominent peak, or Quaker Hill, home to Rhode Island's only Revolutionary War battlefield, and the highest point of all the state's islands, or, closer to our final destination, Durfee Hill, long thought to be the state high point, now the second highest point in the state. Finally, after all that high point rambling around the ocean state, it'll be time for the main event, Jerimoth Hill, Rhode Island's highest point.
Jerimoth Hill is named after Jerimoth Brown, an early settler of this area who owned the hill and a chunk of land around it. When he died in the early 1800s, he was buried on the hill, and his grave still exists a few hundred yards from the summit.
But Jerimoth Hill is not this place's original name. It only gained its current one when it was resurveyed in 1891. Prior to this, it had a more classical name. Throughout the 1800s, it was called Mount Hygeia, after the Greek goddess of health, the name given by Dr. Solomon Drown, who owned the property and settled here in 1801.
By the 20th century, this hill was owned by William Raymond Turner, who in the 1930s would donate the summit area to Brown University, who, in turn, in the 1950s, would build an observatory on it to capitalize on the height and the lack of light pollution in the area. These days, a visit to Jerimoth Hill is a relatively straightforward and low-key affair, but that wasn't always the case. Not too long ago, a visit to the summit here would have vexed even the most stalwart of high pointers. There was a time where this was thought to be one of the most difficult high points to attain, even going so far as to be labeled the most inaccessible high point in the USA.
The problem wasn't at the summit, though. That was still owned by Brown University, and they had no issue with people visiting the hilltop. No, the point of contention was due to access. The easiest route to the Jerimoth Hill summit was on private property, and the owner of that section of land was definitely not keen on visitors.
If the sport of high pointing ever had anything, say, resembling a villain, then that would have been a music teacher named Henry Richardson. Richardson became something of a boogeyman in high pointing circles, even going so far as to gain a rather notorious nickname, the Madman of Jerimoth Hill.
It's a safe assumption to say Henry Richardson did not share the same enthusiasm about state high points as the visitors to his property did. Stories abounded about Richardson and his run-ins with high pointers, and this would fuel Jerimoth Hill's notoriety and reputation of being the most challenging high point in the United States.
Painting Richardson as the villain, well, that's not exactly fair to the man. After all he wanted to do was have his private property respected, something that you and I would all expect with ours. Living next to the high point became something of a curse for Richardson. But despite this, he would leave a legacy. He definitely added a chapter to the history of this place, but more importantly, he became a catalyst for change. Henry Richardson's desire to protect his property set off a series of events that, in the end, would make Jerimoth Hill more accessible for everyone. If there's a lesson to be learned from Henry Richardson and Jerimoth Hill, I believe it to be this: the importance of building good relationships with the landowners who own some of these state high points. It's their goodwill that allows us to access these places. And as we found out here, one individual can put the brakes on our goals of reaching the 50 state high points. So it's imperative that we continue to respect these places and plan accordingly on how we will continue to have access to them, both now and in the future.
Getting to Jerimoth Hill is a straightforward affair. Head towards the town of Foster. Once on State Road 101, the Highpoint trailhead is just off the highway, about a mile from the Connecticut border. You'll be looking for this sign. There's a place to park just beyond the gate.
In the days of no access, you used to have to settle for a sign that was right along Rhode Island 101. That's no longer the case, and that old sign is no longer here. Now you're looking for this sign, and it is actually the start of the trailhead. So let's go check out the summit.
It is a short, easy hike, about 3/10 of a mile. Along the way, keep a lookout for the two benchmarks, one to the left and one to the right. When you do arrive at the summit area, take a moment to reflect on how reaching this nondescript area caused so much consternation not too long ago.
And here we are on the summit of Jerimoth Hill, the highest point in Rhode Island. With an elevation of 812 feet, this is the 46th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scout Taylor. Thanks for joining me today on Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that red subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.